Hi, I'm Wayne Rebhorn. I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and my special focus is on the Renaissance. Well, it is a term used by historians of history, of literature, art, and so on, to refer to a time period that is sandwiched in between the Middle Ages on the one side and what is sometimes called the Enlightenment on the other. If you want to talk about dates, we could say from around 1350 in Italy to around 1650. If you talk about the rest of Western Europe, the dates are slightly modified from about 1500 to 1650. The people in the Renaissance, in the period in question, didn't go around talking about the world they were living in as the world of the Renaissance. They thought of themselves as living in the modern age, or what we would call the contemporary world. It's actually historians in 19th century Europe who came up with this term. The term itself, it's French, and it means rebirth. And that has a very specific meaning. Sometimes people think that when they know that Renaissance means rebirth, what we're talking about is the rebirth of culture after a period of dormancy or decay or something like that. That's actually a kind of prejudice. And I want to step aside for a moment to explain why that's a prejudice and how it's a prejudice. The term Middle Ages, which is used for the period preceding the Renaissance, basically covering the period from the fall of Rome to the beginning of the Renaissance in the 14th century in Italy or later in the rest of Europe, was invented by the Renaissance itself, because they looked backwards in time to antiquity, the ancient world of the Greeks and Romans, and saw this vast, dark space in between, which they called, not inappropriately, the Middle Ages, or the Middle Age, depending on which language you're using. They called it the Dark Ages. They also called it the Age of the Goths. We get this notion of the Middle Ages as a dark age consumed by barbarism from them. The adjective medieval, which is the adjective form for Middle Ages, is in fact pretty negative in most people's mind. Renaissance, by contrast, is a pretty positive term. Anyway, to return, what does this word rebirth refer to? The rebirth in question is the rebirth of classical culture in what they saw, and people in the Renaissance saw, as the modern age. They despised the art and culture of the Middle Ages in varying degrees, and instead they revered the art and the culture of the ancient world of the Greeks and the Romans. They wanted to speak and write Latin the way the ancient Romans had done. They wanted to revise legal systems so they'd be more like the Roman legal system. They wanted to build buildings that looked like Greek and Roman buildings, and so on. I can think of two explanations. One is, if you lived in Italy, you were in fact a descendant of the ancient Romans in a more direct way than if you lived in France or Spain, let alone Germany or Great Britain. And moreover, you had around you the remnants of ancient Roman culture, bits of buildings and occasional statues and things like that, that people you might encounter in your daily life. The second thing, it's quite a different matter. This idea of reviving the ancient world had a great spokesman in the figure Francis Petrarch, or Francesco Petrarca, an Italian poet and writer who propagandized endlessly for the idea of recovering the ancient world. Needless to say, it was doomed to fail, because, in fact, you can't go home again. You can't return to the past. So much had happened in the 1,000 years since the fall of the Roman Empire that you couldn't recreate the ancient world again. You couldn't replace the development of vernacular languages with something else. People spoke French and Spanish and English and German in various ways in Western Europe. Nation states were building where there was once a Roman Empire. Things had been invented that would make Roman warfare, for instance, pointless, like artillery, to say the very least. But even if they had wanted to go back completely, there was one thing that would have held them back. People in the Renaissance were Christians, and the Romans and Greeks were not. In the Middle Ages, identity was something, if I might put it this way, that you inherited. You were the son of your father, the daughter of your mother. If you were the son of a peasant, you were going to be a peasant. If you were the daughter of a lady, you were going to be a lady. In other words, in the Middle Ages at any rate, the concept of social mobility, which is very familiar to all of us because we live in a world filled with social mobility, of people getting, rising up to be better than their parents, or perhaps doing just the opposite. This was not available as a concept, by and large, in the Middle Ages. And this process of social mobility in the Renaissance was enhanced, increased. More people went up and more people went down than had done before. But more important than that, people in the Renaissance began to think of that notion, that moving up and down the scale, as a matter of forming your identity for yourself, not just taking it over wholesale from someone else, from your father, your culture, or what have you. The great Dutch Renaissance scholar Erasmus once said in Latin, "Homines non nascuntur sed finguntur," or men aren't born, they're made. And that, in a certain sense, sums it up. One of the examples is Thomas More. Sir Thomas More, as he was in the period, St. Thomas More, as he's been since the 20th century. Thomas More was the son of a lawyer. He himself was a lawyer, so he didn't start at the very bottom of the heap. But he wound up becoming the Lord Chancellor, the highest political figure under the king during Henry VIII's reign. He did not last a very long time because he could not support Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and wound up getting his head chopped off. Somewhat later, he was succeeded by a less well-known figure named Thomas Cromwell, who was in fact Lord Chancellor, the highest political figure in the realm. He was the son of a blacksmith, which is pretty much as close as you can get to the bottom of the heap. Now, the Renaissance really didn't have a very good way of expressing this new idea of identity as something you form for yourself. They didn't have a sociology or a psychology they could turn to for a wealth of concepts they could use for this purpose. But they had something else. They had the theater. And it's to the theater they turned repeatedly in all sorts of works, which not just plays, to talk about the idea that human beings, in some sense or another, make identities for themselves. They do it by playing roles, which of course is a metaphor from the theater itself. If you were living in about 1599 in London, you might go to see a play at Shakespeare's theater called The Globe. The motto of The Globe was Totus Mundus Agit Histrionem, or all the world plays the actor. Perhaps I should actually use Shakespeare's own words for this, because in a famous speech from As You Like It, a character talks about this concept in the following way. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Let me end by giving you an example, near to hand, of a self-made man from the Renaissance. I'm thinking of none other than William Shakespeare himself, a boy from Stratford, from a small town, who went to London with nothing but what we would call an elementary, maybe beginning secondary school education. Wrote plays, made money, became famous. He, of course, wrote about characters in his plays who grow and adapt and become the selves they are. But in his own life, he did it as well.